Started here. We'll just let people keep coming in. Uh, but welcome to our NACBS Roundtable on America 250 in British Studies. Uh, I am Morgan Wilson, lecturer in history at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And we are going to hear from three experts who will discuss their work, reflect on the United States at 250, 250 years since 1776, in the context of British studies, commemorations we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, and also amid recent politicized attacks on public history. And so this session will be split into three main sections. First, we'll have presentations from each of our speakers, some moderator Q&A in the next section, and then finally we'll take questions from the audience. And if you have questions that you come up with during the presentations, then please put your questions into the chat and we can read them out during the audience Q&A. And if you have questions during that section, you can also raise your hand, the function on Zoom. So first, please allow me to introduce our speakers. First, we are going to hear from Lori Glover, who is the John Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in the History Department at St. Louis University, and past president of both the Southern Association for Women Historians and the Southern Historical Association. And she's also the author of books including The Fate of the Revolution, Virginians Debate the Constitution from 2016, and Eliza Lucas Pinckney, An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution, published in 2020. Our second speaker will be Henry Wilkinson, head of education at Benjamin Franklin House, an 18th century historic house in London and the world's only surviving Franklin residence. He specializes in 18th century British America, the history of London, and the life and legacy of Benjamin Franklin. He serves on the learning advisory panel at historic houses. As an advisor, providing expert guidance on heritage education and management for over 1,400 member sites. And then our third speaker will be Holly Brewer, Burke Professor of American History and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. She's also the author of many articles, as well as books like By Birth or Consent, Children, Law, and the Anglo-American Revolution in Authority from 2007, and of The King's Slaves, The British Empire and the Origins of American Slavery, which is coming in January 2027 with Princeton University Press. So thank you to all three of you for taking the time to be with us and participate in this event. Thank you for everyone in the audience for also being a part of this. And first, let's hear from Lori, and then Henry, and then finally Holly. So Lori, whenever you are ready.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, good morning from St. Louis. I'm happy to be a bit of an interloper and glad to know that the British historians are interested in the American historians. I'm going to share, we intersect a lot more than we sometimes think. I'm going to share some images with you to just talk through my own work. And maybe some things we might think about as our conversation evolves. So, as Morgan said, the most recent monographic book I published is a biography of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who lived for a time in Henry's London and violated many of the laws that Holly has studied over the course of her long career, as she was an entrepreneur, a planter patriarch. Eliza was born in the Caribbean, educated in London, temporarily made a home in South Carolina, moved back to Britain. I think much of her life she identified as a British Carolinian. And then she became a quintessential kind of American patriot and planter patriarch in the last stages of her life. The two most recent things, though, I've been working on are like in two different directions in scholarship. One is a collection that my longtime editing partner and I, Craig Thompson Friend, came out in the fall. It's called The Gendered Republic. And it is work by people who are doing such important cutting edge research young and mid-career scholars who are using gender to redefine the early American Republic beyond the nation state chronology and geography. And so some of the works in that collection do take an Atlantic perspective and emphasize the interconnections between Britain and North America. Others take a continental perspective and emphasize the geopolitics between the emergent North American nation of the United States and the much more longstanding and in some cases much more powerful Native American nations on the continent. And then coming out, I think next month, is a collection that I have with a friend of mine named Kate Brown. And it is an outgrowth of summer work we do at Mount Vernon with the George Washington Teacher Institutes. I don't know how many of you are involved in professional development, like supporting professional development for K through 12 teachers, but Mount Vernon has been at the forefront of that. And so that's what learning through George Washington is. So I have like scholarly interests that are about gender and nation and transnationalism. And then I have teaching interest about making 18th century history in its complexity relevant and useful for teaching in the 21st century. As Morgan mentioned, the main organization I'm involved with is the Southern Historical Association. I would just advertise that we have a decades-long partnership with the Southern Conference on British Studies. That's one of our affiliate organizations. The program for the November meeting in Atlanta is already set. If you want to look at it, that's what the QR code is. And if you're not on the program or not planning on attending the Southern this November, I certainly hope you'll think about if you are situated in the American South. It's usually easy access for British historians to come to the Southern and see the kind of cross-pollination between our organization and British Studies. We have several affiliate organizations in Latin American history and labor history, and maybe the most fruitful over the years has been the Southern Association for Women Historians, which welcomes historians who study gender in the South and who study Southern history. So if you're interested in British gender studies, then you're warmly welcome at SAWH. The Southern has, as most organizations have, American historical associations have this year, the Southern has put a particular emphasis in our fall program on revolutions broadly conceived and understanding the American Revolution in a broader geopolitical and historical context. There is a closing panel that I'm a part of on the South's many revolutions, and Carolyn Eastman, who is the outgoing president of the the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, is moderating our panel. I'm going to be on there with Ryan Quintana, Jessica Roney, and Kathleen Duvall. And so we bring a lot of different perspectives to that. And so that's Morgan had asked us to talk about work our organizations are doing. And so that's maybe I hope, an entree into what the Southern is trying to do to think about America 250, but in a broader context than the celebratory distortions that are going on. So I think commemoration, acknowledgement, investigation, those are better words than celebration, though I don't mind a little celebrating in moderation and in the right context. I am just back from Mount Vernon, where I did an immersive weekend with teachers from across the US. So Mount Vernon led an initiative to have 50 teacher education programs in 2026. I think they're already up to 58 planned that in all of the regions of the United States. And their hope was in every state. I think they're one state short right now of a partnership, but what they have had is teacher ambassadors, practicing K through 12 teachers work with local historical institutions, museums, and sites, sometimes NPS sites, National Park Service sites, to show the intersection between American founding history and their local history. And in a wider context. So it like zooms into the local, it connects that to the national, and it reflects on that in the international. And so, we in the GWTI, George Washington Teacher Institute, generally, we focus on Washington as, of course, an iconic figure in two wars that dragged Britain in and imperiled the empire. We focus as well on Washington in a larger transatlantic world of ideas and consumption. Mount Vernon and Monticello have, I think, and I have the cherry bottle. I don't know if you all know what that is on the far right, but um, last year, the archaeologist at Mount Vernon found a couple of dozen bottles of cherries and other fruits that had been preserved. They imagined by an enslaved cook named Doll. She had the skill to have done that, and they were lost for, 2+ centuries and then recovered. And so I put that on there. Let me just double back and say Mount Vernon has, Monticello has, and I think generally American historians have tried to recenter our understanding of the founding era and of these historic sites and these iconic figures, recenter them in African American history. And so to imagine and remember how Mount Vernon was, of course, the beloved home of, much longed for home of George Washington, but it was primarily a Black community. It was a Black majority community for generations, and the site of um, generations of exploitative enslavement and generations of cultural creation by the African Americans enslaved there. I have also, over the past year, personally been interested in writing about and giving talks about centering women in the history of the American Revolutionary War. So I'm part of a group of scholars. Lauren Duvall is one of the most significant, I think, who are trying to recenter, remind people that the war, because it was from the British perspective, a war of occupation, um, was experienced in people's homes and in their communities. War was not a way, but it was a very visceral, a very domestic experience. And many of the communities and homes were female centered. Simultaneously, the American Revolutionary War that we know about coincided with the greatest self-emancipatory movement in Anglo-American and U.S. history before the American Civil War, with thousands and thousands of enslaved people, including and led in many cases by Black women who are using British policy innovations in the war to seek their own freedom and to borrow familiar language to apply it to a less familiar story, are working to secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. So the records of the Revolutionary era are full of Black women pregnant, running into war zones to try and get behind British lines. I would say that to the question of the challenges that we face as historians, I have at St. Louis University, thankfully, not yet been directly and personally confronted with any challenge to my writing or to my teaching or to my public history partnerships that I do. Um, I know that that is exceptional. I know that that is lucky. I know that that is likely to change if our country continues on its present course, because the challenges to our profession, to academia, to public education. And I just think to like fundamentals of being an intellectual and to being an open-minded citizen, like those challenges are myriad and relentless. And I think they are like one example that captures this is the ongoing struggle in Philadelphia. So the national park site there, and in my experience, generally the NPS is populated by very thoughtful, very careful, and very civic-minded historians who are trying to do their absolute best. And to that end, before the current administration in the United States had centered enslaved people in the household of President Washington, including Ona Judge, who sought her freedom in Philadelphia and is the subject of a magnificent book called Never Caught, about her life of freedom after leaving the president's house. So the NPS had this signage, and then the new presidential administration decided that they would substitute their own ideology and their own erasures for the hard work of the NPS. And then the people of Philadelphia, we the people of Philadelphia said, wait a minute, we have a thought about that as well. And so it's kind of a back and forth um, evolving saga. And so to me, it captures the insidiousness and the relentlessness of the assault on history that we are facing, and the persistence and the will to practice good history that historians and citizens of our country are trying to advance. So I think I'll stop there because I don't want to run over my time. But just thank you again for including me.
Thank you so much, Lori. Henry, whenever you are ready.
Okay, hello everyone. Greetings from London, where Benjamin Franklin House is located. I'm just trying to share my screen so that everyone can see everything. Okay, so I am experiencing a very slow internet at the moment. So if I dip in and out, apologies for that. I'm just trying to get there we go. Hopefully you can all see my slides. Great. So yeah, hello again. I'm the head of education here at Benjamin Franklin House. We are the world's only remaining Franklin residents. Franklin grew up in Boston, made a name for himself in Philadelphia, was the first American ambassador to France, but it's the London home which is still standing, and somewhere that people can come to visit to see a piece of American heritage in the center of London. We're located right next to Trafalgar Square, so we're in the heart of the city. You can see this image on the left. This is the front of the house. It's a very modest 18th century Georgian terraced house. The first floor, the one with the Juliet balconies that you might be able to see, that was Franklin's floor. He essentially lived here as a lodger, and he shared the home with a family, Margaret, who was his landlady, and her daughter, Ollie. And this is where Franklin spent the years 1757 up until 1775. So a lot of the work we do talks about Franklin's experience of the American Revolution and everything leading up to it from a British perspective. So a lot of the work we do links London history, British history, and our shared history with America and Franklin's role in all of that. So in the middle here, we have Franklin's London portrait, very different to his other portraits that you may have seen of Franklin. This one shows him very much as a British intellectual with a bust of Isaac Newton looking down at him, fulfilling the part of the British upper class person that he needed to be in order to talk to the government and people that he was discussing things with during that time where you have things like the Boston Tea Party. Franklin was here witnessing that and how that was reported by the British press, for example. Today we function as a historic house. We do a lot of programming for the public, obviously, but we also have a huge education department, which I'm going to be mostly talking about today because a lot of you over in America might be surprised to learn that British school children don't learn about the American Revolution, and they have a few opportunities in their career at school to actually study that period. So some of the things we do is try to provide that in extracurricular ways. A lot of the things we focus on is Franklin's science, but in doing that, we talk about his contributions to Anglo-American heritage as well. For those of you who might not be familiar, Franklin is obviously one of the most famous of the founders. Here we have the Declaration of Independence with Franklin's signature highlighted. Franklin was one of the 5 who drafted the Declaration. We can see him here. Obviously, it was mostly Jefferson's work, but Franklin was very much the proofreader, and actually the final person to read it the night before 4th of July. Jefferson trusted Franklin to be the final editor of the Declaration. And we also talk a lot about Franklin's role during the war. So here we have the Treaty of Paris, again with Franklin's signature, and this lovely portrait, again with Franklin present, essentially ending the American Revolutionary War. And something we talk about with school children is how it begins at the beginning of the 18th century as a somewhat harmonious relationship, and becomes what we know as today the American Revolution. Just interestingly about this portrait as well, this is the American delegation signing the Treaty of Paris, and the British delegation refused to sit for this portrait, and so it remains unfinished. And this is a nice example of where things were left in 1780s. So again, we use this to talk to kids about how the relationship between the two nations have changed over time, and Franklin's role in that. So like Laurie said, we were asked to talk about some of the things that we've done to commemorate America 250. And what you can see at the moment is essentially everything we've done in 2026. Our commemorations began as early as 2023, celebrating all the 250 milestones, like, for example, the Tea Party, the coercive acts and things. But this is what we've done this year. So starting top left and then going clockwise, we began the year at the United States Embassy, who's one of our key partners. They invited 150 school children that were aged 16 to 18 to come and hear from curators across the UK about America 250 programming that might interest them. So as well as Benjamin Franklin House, we had the British Library, the American Museum and Gardens in Bath, and also the National Archives come and talk about things that they're doing for America 250. And if anyone is coming to London in the next month or so, there is an excellent exhibition at the National Archives that displays all of the documents that they have relating to the revolution, and a lot of it is told from the British perspective. Top center, we have a debate competition that we run with the United States Embassy, and this year we focus that on talking about the legacy of the Anglo-American relationship and what that means to young people today. So again, we're talking about 14 to 18-year-olds coming to talk about the special relationship, American politics today, and also the legacy of the founders too. Next to that, we have a literary competition for 18 to 25-year-olds. This gets young people, again, to engage with Franklin's legacy, specifically responding to a quote. This year's quote was Franklin's famous response to the question, "What have we got? A republic if you can keep it." Underneath that, we appeared on the Lucy Worsley documentary, which came out on PBS and BBC. So for those watching in America, it should be available on PBS. And it's, again, talking about the British perspective of the American Revolution. We appear in episode 1, talking about Franklin's role as colonial agent in the build-up to the war breaking out. Below that, we had a conference, a 2-day conference talking about the women of the revolution. So we discussed, we used Abigail Adams' quote, remember the ladies. We discussed some unheard stories of people that took part in the revolution that are often overlooked or not talked about as much as they should. trying to go as quickly as possible so I don't take up too much time. But next to that, we have a picture some of you might recognize if you're big Franklin fans. This is Walter Isaacson. He is one of Franklin's biographers. We awarded the Benjamin Franklin House Medal, which is something that we do every couple of years to honor somebody who's contributed to Anglo-American relations or Franklin's legacy in today's world. Next to him, you can see the current US ambassador of the United States to the United Kingdom, Warren Stevens, who was in attendance as well. We've also launched a podcast. This one is available online on Spotify, YouTube. So if you want to have a listen, we talk to partner sites in the US. So we had 3 sites in Boston and 3 in Philadelphia, all of which were either founded by Franklin or he was a former member of. So for example, we talked to his school, the Boston Latin School, the American Philosophical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the University of Pennsylvania as well, to name a few. So they talk about Franklin's role in founding those organizations and how he experienced 18th century Boston, 18th century Philadelphia. For the general public, we also have done some American history tours around London, linking local history. For a lot of these participants come from London and have no idea how much American history is in the city. And it also retraces Franklin's steps around Westminster as well, talking about what he was doing during those years building up to the Revolutionary War. And then the last 2 images in the center, the one just above the poster for the tours, this happened this week. This was, these 2 gentlemen are from the Sancho Project, and they bring to life songs by Ignatius Sancho. And behind them, you can see 2 portraits of individuals that lived in the house. They were 2 enslaved people that Franklin brought to London with him during his time here in the city. And in the last year, we've done a lot of work bringing their stories to the center of attention. These portraits were commissioned by an artist who recreates individuals with no imagery surviving of their identities. So we used all the sources that we have about them to create an image of these 2, and they now hang in the house and part of our exhibition talking about Franklin's role in slavery and also his eventual abolitionism as well. So we like to talk about Franklin's period of change that undergoes during his time here in London. And then lastly, in the center, we were very lucky to have the National Archives let us borrow one of 27 declarations of independence. So you can see that in the center. And we hosted a special event that was attended by the US ambassador, Warren Stevens, David Lammy, who at the time was Deputy Prime Minister, and then the gentleman on the left is our chairman, John Straczynski. So we've done a lot, especially around the summer months. This is when we're busiest and when we have the most American tourists and the most public coming in and out. So we have very much done everything we can to commemorate America 250 this year. Very quickly, as head of education, worth quick mention of the education program. Like I said at the start, we do a lot of work trying to bring Franklin's legacy into British schools. Most of the schools we engage on a classroom level are primary, so elementary schools, talking about Franklin's science, the American Revolution, his role in that. And we have an excellent program for special education needs, disabilities. We also provide work for home educated students. We have a chess club, and we have learning resources that are currently being developed that are applicable to both British and US curriculums, and they cover topics including science, but also we have one coming out soon about the causes of the American Revolution, so that teachers in the UK especially have some support in teaching that to their kids. I think that's the end of my PowerPoint. So if anyone has any questions about the work we do or the work that we're going to be doing, we are now looking ahead to the next few years of programming. Then do feel free to ask in the chat, and I will end there, I think.
Thank you so much. Okay, Holly, you are up next.
Holly, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. Let's see. I just want to share. Sorry. the just uh slideshow. It's for some reason that I keep trying to, there we go. I'm just trying to show the slideshow and I kept getting the screen for the Zoom in front of the commands I needed. So I want to talk sort of about the big questions. I've been to 3 exhibits about the America 250 this year, or just in the last few months. One at the Gray Art Museum at NYU, which actually I helped to advise on, which is about the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, and it's really wonderful. Actually, I couldn't believe how well it turned out. It was one of those situations where you give a little bit of advice and it goes a long way. And so they really did this fantastic job, really thinking through what all the different grievances meant. And then a second at the National Archives UK, which has already been mentioned, which is also, it's just incredible what they found in their records when they put their mind to it. And of course, what do they have? Just treasures that often nobody has even found or looked at. So I'll talk about one of those, which I have an image of today. And then also at the Library of Congress, which actually has had 2 exhibits, one which was on until July 4th on the 2 Georges, Georgia 3rd and George Washington, which was amazing. And then a new one on the Declaration of Independence, which I would also recommend. And what I wanted to sketch out for today was some of the really big issues that frame what the discussions are right now. And I'm not just talking about whether things are censored or not, although that's a huge question. And I think it's far more complex than we've even really been talking about. Like, because I think in general, we tend to tell nationalist narratives of the British, of the American Revolution, or as was noted earlier in Britain, to sort of ignore the American Revolution altogether. A lot of things get hidden. I've just written an article, can't believe I wrote this, but for Index on Censorship about how paintings of Black boys wearing silver collars of bondage that are British are generally censored and not put on display. This is part of a general pattern of ignoring some really difficult issues. Anyway, so this is a 1768 map, and I've marked on it the locations of the various British colonies. By my count, there were 41 in 1776, in all of which I would add slavery was legal just because it's important to what I'm going to say later. But only 13 of them rebelled. And so there were really important underlying questions. And I've written them out here just so we can think about them in the biggest possible sense. Why did only some colonies in Britain's empire rebel? Why was the revolution fought? Was it justified? Was the king really a bad king? How does North America fit into the broader history of the British Empire? And I would submit, by the way, that it tends to kind of get ignored or downplayed, even though it was, in fact, really important earlier. And why did the British, who were so powerful and wealthy, lose? And obviously, I'm not going to answer all those questions today, but this is one of the slides I use when I teach the American Revolution. And just getting students to think about what some of these questions are with respect to, with a particular focus on George III. Was he mad, as obviously later on he certainly was, or bad, or incompetent, or corrupt, or a good king, protector of the downtrodden, that is, native peoples, the enslaved and loyalists, or simply exercising his legal powers and privileges as king over territories that belonged to him, which is how he always referred to them, by the way. So in terms of his being a protector of the downtrodden, I think a lot of scholarship in early American history and the New Republic has recently been emphasizing that. And so I'm not going to go through all that. There simply isn't time. But one now a very common interpretation, emphasis, and certainly this is one of the origins of the revolution, emphasizes the proclamation line of 1763, drawn by George III, which he sent troops to protect, and you can see it here from a map from 1766. Um, and that prevented the colonists from moving westward and protected the Native Americans from the colonists. So if you emphasize the issue of the American Revolution being fought, the purpose of it being to expand westward, then King George III looks like a protector of Native Americans. And it's really it was really surprising to me to learn only within the last decade, that the proclamation line of 1763 is still used in Canada by Native Americans litigating for protection of their lands, which is just extraordinary. Um, another another way he could be seen as a possible protector is in 1775, Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which was added to later in 1782, announced that any enslaved people or servants who were belonged to people who were in rebellion against the king and refused to swear loyalty, if they came and fought on the British side, would be given their freedom. And so these are both now. It's almost like and certainly the exhibit at the National Archives in the UK emphasizes these two aspects of the American Revolution. They also emphasize the others, which are about whether or not the claims to rights which the colonists were making, which of course they have many documents about. This is actually a 1764 cartoon, and it shows Lord Bute taking the king's little finger, and he's kind of hidden behind a cloud on the scales of justice, and it's outweighing all these other things: liberty of the press, freedom of elections, Magna Carta, Bill of Rights. And of course, the American Revolution was, in a deeper sense, part of a broader sort of struggle over rights within England itself in the 1760s, involving rotten boroughs and many other kinds of issues. Um, and in terms of what's emphasized in a lot of colonial American newspapers, are issues like the stamp tax is so heavy on paper, including paper that newspapers would be printed on, that it would basically prevent newspapers from being able to publish, for example. And of course, here is Tom Paine's famous Common Sense, where he blames the King of England for doing things for enacting laws and that are very that restrict the rights of many people in many ways, which I won't go into here, but of course is well known. And this is a contemporary engraving of the ships that arrived with the troops into Boston after the Stamp Act riots in 1767, and then the troops that were stationed there. So I think certainly any reasonable telling of the American Revolution has to emphasize these different kinds of factors. But what I want to emphasize a little bit more today, and this is partly influenced by my own work, but it is also the ways in which how expensive the revolution was for Britain and why they were willing to do it a little bit more. And just, I think, especially I've come to believe that this common claim that there was a salutary neglect of America by Britain before the 1760s, and then these taxes led to a kind of inordinate response by the colonists that was unreasonable because they should be paying their way in taxes or whatever. I think that understanding is really problematic, and that at the very least we need to think more deeply about what Britain had at stake and why they were willing to fight this war, and particularly the king. What you see here is one of my photograph featuring the main curator who helped do this exhibit at the UK National Archives, of one of the things he found when he was looking up materials to share. This was literally on a long roll, like like you would have cloth fabric rolled today. And he unrolled it, and he said that the people who pulled it up were really upset because it was so heavy, and they're like, "What are you ordering?" Anyway, this is actually um, a was created in 1782, apparently for Parliament by the Naval Office or by the War Office to explain the cost of the war. And this was simply for New York, for just one colony slash state, the amount that Britain spent in provisions. And they're all listed here. And if you could close up, which I can't really do on this screen, you can see some of the items. And among other things, it includes 9 million pounds of pork. So this gives you a sense of the cost of the war. And this is, of course, now this is another graph that shows, again, contemporary what was happening with Britain's national debt after the Revolutionary War and the big climb up. These are the costs of wars and how they're increasing the national debt. And the big climb up is, of course, they're calling it the Continental War here at the very end. Is leading to huge new debts by Britain. So they're willing to spend a ton of money to keep the colonies, the North American colonies. And I would submit that's partly because they were also making a ton of money from them. So this is one of my photographs from the National Archives records of customs collection. And you can see here, not that you can see very clearly, but like third line down, impositions on tobacco and sugar. And you can see the amounts coming in. Tobacco was incredibly highly taxed, especially. And it had to be sent back to England, where there was a tax of about 8 1/3 pennies a pound on it by 1750, and it only cost a penny a pound in Virginia and Maryland. So this is just a huge tax. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Just a second. Um, and this is my estimates from looking at the customs revenues of just the gross tobacco revenue to the crown over time. And it's a little bit more complicated because there were things taken out of this directly to pay to naval sailors, et cetera. But this is about the tobacco revenue by itself was something like 10 to 15% of crown revenue by 1750. And it was one of the most secure forms of crown revenue used, that was what used to pay the national debt, the little old ladies who invested their pensions. They got a lot of it out of the tobacco revenue. So what I want to suggest then is that in the larger sense, we should be taking the claims about rights seriously, that the colonists were making, partly because I don't think, although I think you absolutely can make arguments for the King of England protecting Native Americans and African Americans who fought on the British side, that wasn't the reason the British fought the war. And there were very serious issues over rights and representation that were being contested. And I would emphasize, by the way, in particular, not just taxes, but the fact that by 1774, Britain, King, and Parliament had confiscated Massachusetts charter and their very frame of government and put them under martial law, which was a huge issue. But what I want to emphasize here too is that in the drafting of the Declaration and the rights claims that were made by it, and this is from the original draft, rough draft, which is at the Library of Congress. This is from page 1. That these rights claims were real and really important, and the American Revolution really did I mean, this is crucial to why it was fought by the American revolutionaries, and that they were meant to be inclusive. And I want to point really quickly here to the deleted clauses of the Declaration of Independence, which, yes, they were taken out, but did very strongly condemn slavery in particular and the role of the King of England in making slavery legal and legitimate across the empire. And when Jefferson wrote the word men in all caps here, and I'll just show you a close up here. Well, this is he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into another hemisphere. Sorry, sorry, my screen is or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative, that is, vetoed every effort for suppressing every legislative effort to restrain this execrable commerce. And so you can see a close up here of the men in all caps and italics. The only other place that Jefferson wrote that was the words United States of America. And it's very clear from the conversation and debate in the on July 1st that every people I mean what little we know about it, it wasn't completely recorded, but there's a few things that come out of it that in terms of letters that they understood, and Jefferson's reflections and others' reflections afterwards, that the men referred to Africans. Um, so what I really want to say here is that Jefferson, on some level, was right about the role of the Britain on the monarchy in supporting slavery. And this is a proclamation from James, Duke of York, about the slave trade, which he was in charge of in 1675, and he's later James II. And this is troops on the ground in Africa protecting this slave trade, and of course the Navy did that too. And when the revolution, as they're negotiating the end of the revolution, and this is a contemporary engraving of George III is the one in the hat behind, or the plume behind, and he's trying to get the empire rebuilt so that he gets his old customs revenues back because they had gone down significantly because of the war, especially tobacco. And this is them trying to recover it. And one of the consequences of the treaty that got negotiated at the end of the war, which you saw another picture of it about the negotiators, is that I argue that slavery was actually protected by that treaty, or the legal underpinnings of slavery were protected by that treaty by also protecting the debt that was owed from before the war, for which slaves were collateral. And one of the really fascinating things, which you can also see at the exhibit, and I've seen before, and I looked it up before, but actually on display, these 2 pages at the UK exhibit, is right here. You can see this little cap where the into the treaty at the very end was put this incredible language about how the British had to return the quote unquote Negroes who'd run away to them, that in response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, to the Americans as their property before leaving America. But it's put in at the last minute with this little cap insert. And you can see here then the signatures. And on the very next page, if you turn the page, is a little paragraph saying that this insertion was in there before everyone had signed and sealed the document. This is just, I emphasize some of these things which are out of my book, which I include a picture of here. But most of all, I just want to say that there's so many important questions to answer and to ask about the connections between Britain and America and the American Revolution still. There's so much still more to discover as we try to negotiate and balance between the big questions I raised at the beginning, which was, why is it fought? What is the role of the king? Why did Britain lose? And that slavery, among other things, is not a peripheral question, but central to the whole story. Sorry. I realize you probably were not seeing my whole face the entire time.
Thank you very much, Holly. And yeah, you have left off with a very sort of poignant central question that we could still continue to look at. So thank you for that. And thank you, all three of you, for your great presentations, all really interesting. Um, so we're going to go into our moderator Q&A session. But as we're doing that, as I'm posing questions to our speakers, for our audience, you can still put questions that you have into the chat and we'll get to them. I can read them out if you would like during our audience Q&A session, or during that section, you can raise your hand with the Zoom function and ask your questions directly. But first, I want to just pose a few questions to our speakers, our panel. And one just to start with is, we've gone through this whole summer and through much of this year seeing commemorations around 1776, some in the UK, some in the US. And I just wonder whether from your own organization or institution or other things that you observed or went to, perhaps, what's a commemoration or event that's been just interesting to you or memorable for you? Because I know for me, watching on C-SPAN at Monticello, there was a rendition of the national anthem, um, a bones and banjo rendition, which I had never considered or seen before, and yet it's just one of those unexpected things that stands out amidst the many fireworks shows and very more solemn occasions. But it could even be something like that. So whoever would like to start, just what's a marking that's stood out to you?
So I have I've traveled a lot this summer to do commemorative like educational things. But the thing I found most moving, I watched on YouTube, and they did a naturalization ceremony at Mount Vernon on the 4th of July.
Mm.
And it was extremely hopeful. And they have a character interpreter who embodies Washington, and um, he's very good. And at the end, the leadership at Mount Vernon spoke, and at the end he spoke, and he said, "Welcome home."
I love it.
Amazing.
I
Holly,
mean, yeah, I would just emphasize that the UK the National Archives, their exhibit there is absolutely worth traveling to if you're anywhere near. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I would say from the British perspective, the World Cup, I would say, was more widely reported over here in the UK in terms of what was going on around 4th of July. Trump's State Fair was in the headlines quite a bit as well. But it's nice to see that there's been a lot of institutions across the UK that have commemorated 4th of July using a lot of their own links to the revolution. I mentioned at the start several organizations that took part at the beginning of the year in this event that talked about what they were doing. And I would second what Holly said in saying that the National Archives, I think, if you want to hear and see the British perspective of the American Revolution, that's the best place to come and see it in the setting where a lot of this stuff happened.
Yeah.
great. Now, all of your presentations, I think, touched on this to different degrees, but I do want to ask, thinking about, this broader context for the colonial period, the Revolutionary era. Uh, Holly, especially, I think, highlighted some of the scholarly openings that there still are for understanding this topic in these wider contexts. But I wonder, what are things that even popular narratives, especially in the US, but we can also address in the UK. What is something that they leave out, but really could enhance our view of this period of 1776? Could be this idea of, was George really a bad king? Because I know I wonder, and have had to unpack, I think, growing up in the US school system where it's this extremely tyrannical king who maybe had absolute power and abused it, led to this revolution, and yet this is a post 1688 history. There is a constitutional monarchy. I don't know if everyday Americans necessarily understand those nuances to it. So I wonder if there's something like that that you haven't maybe touched on in your presentation that the popular narratives really could benefit from.
I mean, I can touch on that last issue. It is super important, but there was a sense, at least my understanding, having read quite a few of the secondary sources, including the recent books by, I think is it Andrew Robertson, on the Georgia Third. But anyway, in terms of this constitutional king question, of course, George III was more limited in the kinds of powers he had than, say, James II. he was supposed to abide by the law, and many of the taxes imposed on the colonists were, of course, consented to by Parliament. But towards the end, the decision to push towards war and was really shaped by George III a lot. I think that was the contemporary perspective that he insisted on it. And of course, he got to choose still who the prime minister was, and he could appoint people to new positions if he wanted to, or, pay them money to shift their opinions about what he wanted to do. And so it's really fascinating to see in 1782 and 83 an effort by Parliament after this war has really failed to try to restrict George III's powers a little bit more. His power, particularly to grant lifetime pensions or other honors, like how many he could do in a year, for example, or, and of course, new pushes for reform, and even in terms of how Ireland was governed, giving them more power to the Irish Parliament that was temporary but was there. So, in other words, there was a sense that the king had, even though he was constrained, he was really more responsible for the war and trying to put more restraints on him. But that is a really important and interesting question. And again, one I think we haven't explored enough.
I think something that we try to talk about a lot is how invasive the Revolutionary War was and how it divided people on right down to family members, business partners, colleagues, everyday people, and how it wasn't sort of everyone against the king, and that there were a lot of loyalists. And what happened to them after the revolution? What was the fallout for those people who remained loyal to George? I don't think that really gets talked about because it tends to be overshadowed by the developments of the early United States. So we tried to talk using Benjamin Franklin as an example. His relationship with his own son was destroyed by the fact that they disagreed over the revolution. And narratives like that, we find, don't really get talked about in terms of how it affected the everyday person, especially those that disagreed with their neighbor.
So I agree with all of that, and would just add the other thing that doesn't get discussed much is, so Holly showed the map and said the empire parliamentary leaders called it the Continental War. Well, the money is continental, the Congress is continental, the army is continental, in the framing of the Patriots. And erased in that is that simultaneous to a war against the British Empire and for rights and internal in North America, it is a war for Indian land and Native and over Native American sovereignty. And so that's not a either or, that's a both and in fact it's
Yeah.
an ampersand,
Yeah.
because how are the North Americans going to repay their war debt? How are they going to pay the foreign creditors? How are they going to pay the soldiers' pensions? They're going to pay it with the only asset they envision, which is Western lands, which they do not own, and need, a powerful military and a powerful central government in order to affect those visions of territorial expansion and land acquisition. And I think that like if we're moving from an Atlantic to an interior to a Western, like those are three different ways of thinking about what stories we might be missing.
Can I just, one of the questions from the audience was about the map of 1763 and it relates. So if I can just pull that up for a minute. Sorry, I'll put it in the share button. So this is the map again, just to remind you, and somebody wanted the background. And first of all, just in addition to what Lori was just saying, negotiating over legal title to Western lands up to the Mississippi was crucial to the negotiations over the peace. Absolutely crucial, as well as then negotiations about repaying the debt from before the war, which so many planters in particular had, and for which the slaves were collateral. So this is all, it's not like exterior to it, it's really crucial. But this map is the line that goes down there in the middle, just sort of I can't tell how to, but like not the Mississippi River, but the line that's closer, that's the proclamation line of 1763. And one of the crucial reason for it was Pontiac's rebellion and the essentially the Native Americans, when the fighting is done in North America between France and England, and France gives up its claims to North America, the Native Americans, they lost their most important ally, but they don't want to just be, subject to exploitation and movement out there, and they stage a rebellion which the British have to fight and or decide to fight and put down. But then the part of the terms of the peace, which the Native Americans are demanding, is the Proclamation Line of 1763. So it isn't just the king's goodness of heart that's behind this. It's also a jurisdictional category. So what you actually see too on some maps is the this called the Northwest Territory. I mean, there is actually a name. It's like almost looks like another colony. I had to pause about whether to count it. It was a little confused sometimes, but it certainly is now a new jurisdiction, and so that is part of the background. But I think one of the other really feel fascinating things about this particular map, which you could see more if I were to blow it up, is exactly how many troops were stationed on the ground even before the Stamp Act riots. And in fact, not many in Boston, which was probably part of the problem, but to enforce that proclamation line. And again, that's part of the reason for the taxes. So I'm going to stop sharing, but hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. So as as our speakers have mentioned, and as I want to make sure we think about and discuss during the session, so in the United States, in the past year and a half or so, we've seen messaging, different efforts at policy changes around how American history, whether it's in signs, as Lori mentioned with Philadelphia, exhibitions at national parks, at the Smithsonian Institution. Last month, there was the White House Domestic Policy Council's report on the Smithsonian, and it was very focused, I would say, on the National Museum of American History, specifically in the Smithsonian Network. And this report accuses the American History Museum of having, and I'm quoting, this is from page 6 of the report, that it's become subject to institutional capture by a radical activist ideology that is fundamentally opposed to telling the noble, honest story of the great country we know and love, end quote. And so I think this speaks to, like I said, this larger atmosphere of these discussions, these very public and high level discussions in the government about how American history is understood, is portrayed, presented. Uh, why, as people who are trained and experienced in researching and teaching and in education, uh, what are your thoughts on this sort of intellectual direction or guidance on how to present history being directed from the White House, or if you've observed this at all, Henry, in the UK, from somewhere like 10 Downing? Because it seems like changing or shaping how history is presented to the American public is a priority of this current administration. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of top-down guidance as, again, people who have training and experience in these different historical practices and presentation.
Well, I think it's dangerous. I think it's insulting to good history. Um, and it is not so there's a place for heritage narratives and a sense of personal and national connection to the past and heritage, and that and politics has a place. It's not the place, it's not academic history, it's not public history, it's not history education. And so sometimes those things get confused and blurred, despite the distinction. But this is a different thing entirely. And this is, I think, more systematic. It's more driven by, an ideology about, with an awareness of, uh, who matters in the past and the stories you tell about the past and how you instruct children on the past will shape the present. So I find it profoundly concerning. And also it's just bad history.
Mhm.
But later on, I'll tell you what I really think.
Um, So obviously it's appalling that this is coming from the White House and it's so uninformed. I mean, it's not like Trump knows much about the actual history, right? Or I mean, um, but to me, it speaks to these broader issues about what we're supposed to learn from the past. And I think, I mean, the past has a huge power on the present. And we see that even in Supreme Court decisions. And, what was the American founding? What was it meant to be? And therefore, what can we take away from it or not? And one of my colleagues, Ira Berlin, was really crucial at getting the Museum of African American History and Culture built in the first place. And I know what a struggle that was, and also how important it is to be able to tell that story. Because for a long time, so much of it was just silenced. I mean, I remember going to Charleston, I guess it was almost 30 years ago now. I used to teach at NC State near you, Morgan. And trying to find evidence of slavery. And at that point, like there technically was supposed to be a little museum where the slave auction site was, but it was always closed. Like you couldn't go there. It was like there was a closed sign over it, and you couldn't even tell really what it was. And it was just, I mean, Drayton Hall, I remember had some good, but mostly it was just the silence. And so starting to reckon with this part of the story is really crucial. But I also think it's really important we don't reckon with it in a simplistic way. And the Smithsonian I don't think does that, nor did any of the other exhibits. I think they're real. I think in fact the efforts coming from the White House are the simplistic ones. But it's still really important that we also not say too simplistically, all the ideals of the American Revolution were nonsense. Nobody really cared about any of this stuff, right? Equality, schmality, they didn't enforce it, therefore it's not an American principle, right? Which frankly, I'm going to pause right here and say, if you've not read John Roberts' report on the state of the courts, end of your report from 2025, that's sort of what he's saying. Like the principles of the Declaration of Independence were not enforced, therefore they're not legally valid, right? And it's like, whoa, where are we going with all this, right? Um, but I will also say that I don't think Britain has had enough of the same kind of reckoning in terms of some of these issues. Like efforts to do that by the National Trust Report a few years ago have been really pushed back on. And I mentioned this briefly, this article I've just written for Index on Censorship about hiding paintings and images, like it's actually about a dog collar museum at Leeds Castle, which has been around for 50 years. And what happened when they realized that some of those collars, maybe even many of them, weren't actually collars meant for dogs, but rather people, and they just closed it, right? And they had without fanfare. So, as they're beginning, if this is a very subtle point, and probably, this is probably too delicate for, I do think there's a lot of royal patronage of museums, in particular, and that means that some things which might get a little bit more fully dealt with are not dealt with in the ways they could be, and that even as things like the National Gallery have been, there have been new exhibits that deal a little bit more with slavery. It's almost as though it's a parliamentary project, and the monarch has nothing to do with it. So I'm just saying that there's really important issues here that we're still unpacking. And I think telling a fuller history that accounts for the stories of many different kinds of people is a difficult thing, and censorship comes in many forms.
Sure. Yeah. Briefly, if Henry, you could just sort of describe if you've observed similar tensions in the UK as far as, history education. And then I'll just ask one more question before we go into our audience section.
Yeah, so coming from an education perspective, what I would say is often the most contentious issue is what is and isn't mandatory in the national curriculum. So the government telling schools what a young person should learn about during their time in education. And I think what we've seen over the last few decades is a move away from prescribed individuals, topics, and to more broader optional areas of study that allow teachers to choose the direction that they go in, or schools to choose the direction they go in when teaching history. I think the biggest threat to UK schooling in terms of covering topics such as these is the amount of time that they have to actually teach history, because one of the biggest debates we have is what teachers are able to actually deliver in the amount of time they're given to teach arts and humanities subjects. And I think we've seen a move, or a sort of arts and humanities in general, come under a slight threat of being disregarded as core subjects. And we see that a lot of teachers tend to stick to the usual periods that they're familiar with, because there aren't the resources out there to teach world history or broader topics that might not have been taught 20 years ago. But I think we are moving in the right direction, and there is more freedom for teachers and schools to choose histories that they want to tell. And I think that is a good thing. But again, just being able to fit that in a child's educational career. I mentioned at the start that the American Revolution doesn't get covered because there are so many topics that teachers have to deliver. And often they'll go for the most familiar ones. So I think finding a way to bring these unfamiliar topics into the school classrooms is key. And institutions like the Franklin House try to do that by offering it extracurricular in line with curriculum-linked topics.
Can I just
So
add one tiny thing to that, which is that these arguments are not new. And so in 1999, there was an effort to create a standardized history test like they were creating for English and math, which we all know got created. And Gary Nash, who was one of my mentors at UCLA, was involved in that. And that, of course, Lynn Cheney, the mother of Liz Cheney, was the one who then opposed those standards. And the end result was that there was no history test. Like they took the history test out of the lineup because they couldn't agree about whether to address questions about slavery and stuff. There's a long history of this. It's not new.
Right. So just one somewhat practical question. And I'm thinking about, say, graduate students or early career scholars who want to engage with history with other experts or scholars. Just do you have suggestions for public-facing types of activities, outside of things like degree requirements and classroom teaching, but other ways that graduate students or early career scholars can get involved in public history? Big or
I
small?
think I think my suggestion would just be to reach out to places and let them know you're available because they don't even know who to contact or where to go. Often universities also have expert lists. I mean, it's probably not graduate students so much on those, but if you think you have something to contribute, you could also reach out to your expert lists of publicity contacts at your university.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think Holly's on the right track. I also think that most organizations, history organizations, are pivoting or have pivoted with the recognition that we can no longer serve tenured faculty at research universities with expense accounts exclusively, right? So we have to broaden who is in our community of practicing historians because I'm not sure what's happening in the UK, but in the US, there are just fewer and fewer lines at universities for tenure track faculty, and the financial circumstances are just shifted. More and more of our colleagues are contingent faculty. More and more are working in applied history and in public history. And so think about where your intellectual home is going to be, like where your academic home is. Is it a thematic group? Like there's a legal history group. There's an environmental history group. Is it chronological? There's a Civil War era group. There's an early republic and so on and so forth. And see if those organizations are doing they have mentorship with young scholars and or they have public outreach wings that they're working on. So in addition to like your local, which would, as Holly said, would be the first stop, think about national and regional historical organizations.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and just sort of going on the back of that as well, in the UK especially, there's a lot of museums that are really keen to reach out and engage 18 to 25-year-olds in general. A lot of sites will have youth panels, for example, which is a great way to get engaged in actual strategy and sort of shaping the way that museums engage young people and tell stories that they feel are relevant to that demographic. And it's a great way to gain experience and to potentially share any research or areas of interest that the museum might be wanting to have from this particular group of people. So I think definitely looking out for fellowship schemes, apprenticeships. A lot of museums do historical skills apprenticeships now in things like stonemasonry, for example, or tapestry conservation. There's a lot of stuff out there for early careers, people who want to work in the heritage industry. And I think going directly to the museums is a way to do that, as well as going obviously to universities and other places.
Great. Now I want to make sure that we get to at least some of our audience questions here.